inaugural Africa Climate Summit kicked off in Nairobi, Kenya, with the continent seeking to change the narrative around climate change. The summit aimed to develop a common African position ahead of a UN climate conference next month in New York and the COP28 summit in the United Arab Emirates in November. African countries are disproportionately bearing the brunt of climate change, despite contributing the least to global emissions. Here's a report.
This week was big for Kenya. It played host as leaders gathered in capital Nairobi for the first Africa Climate Summit. The leaders aim to highlight the continent that will suffer the most from climate change while contributing the least. The three-day meet had things set on the agenda. African leaders are uniting ahead of the United Nations Climate Conference, and on top of their to-do list is climate funding. The Nairobi meeting is billed as bringing together leaders from the 54-nation continent to define a shared vision of Africa's green development, an ambitious aim in a politically and economically diverse region whose communities are among the most vulnerable to climate change.
The possibilities are not just promising, they are transformative. Africa can power all our energy needs with renewable resources. The continent has enough potential to be entirely self-sufficient with the mixture of wind, solar, geothermal, sustainable biomass, and hydropower. In Africa, we can be a green industrial hub that helps other regions achieve their net zero strategies by 2050.
But as the forum kicked off, significant investment in Africa's adaptation to climate change, including better forecasting, will be an urgent goal. At the heart of every issue on the agenda, from energy to agriculture, is the lack of data collection that drives decisions as crucial as when to plant and when to flee. The African continent is larger than China, India, and the United States combined, and yet Africa has just 37 radar facilities for tracking weather, an essential tool along with satellite data and surface monitoring, according to a World Meteorological Organization database. Europe, in comparison, has 354 radar facilities, while North America has 291.
So the continent is really at the crossroad, and while it emits less than 4% of global emissions, as we've said, it is going to be the most affected, and it is already the most affected, for instance, through water events, be them floods or droughts.
The widespread inability to track and forecast the weather affects key development choices. Kenya, the host of the climate summit, is one of the very few countries in Africa seen as having a relatively well-developed weather service. The others are South Africa and Morocco. Kenya has allocated about $12 million this year for its meteorological service, according to the National Treasury. A small figure when compared to the US National Weather Service budget request for this year, which was $1.3 billion. The vast expanse of the 54-nation African continent is relatively unserved and unwarned.
We have ample renewable energy potential as well, and the natural assets and resources to green our own consumption, but also to meaningfully contribute to decarbonization of the global economy. We must see in green growth not just a climate imperative, but also a fountain of multi-billion-dollar economic opportunities that Africa and the world is primed to capitalize.
And because of a lack of funding, the number of observations by atmospheric devices usually used with weather balloons decreased by as much as 50% over Africa between 2015 and 2020. Experts have raised concern over the lack of monitoring, while some have even called Africa a climate risk blind spot because of the same.
And more efforts, therefore, are needed locally and internationally to support adaptation to climate change, to invest in climate solution. And there is really an opportunity with the summit that takes place this week and next to accelerate action, to really deliver the financial commitments that have been made since years, so that we can build this rapid and essential impact needed in the next decade.
At present, fewer than 20% of sub-Saharan African countries provide reliable weather services. But things are slowly moving in the right direction. 13 of the most data-sparse African countries, including Ethiopia, Madagascar and Congo, are getting money to improve weather data collection and sharing from a United Nations-created trust fund. The systematic observations financing facility, an older funding mechanism with many of the same partners, climate risk and early warning systems, has supported modernizing meteorological systems in a half-dozen West and Central African countries. And it's not just forecasting. As climate shocks, such as Somalia's worst drought in decades, become more common, better recording of weather data is a critical need for decision-making. Bureau Report, WION World is One.